of what's in the laboratory. Those of you who have seen this morning, Abby talked about the Solvita test. We had discussions about it. This is something that he invented, and he's come all the way from Maine to share a little bit about that test and the secrets of the soil. So with that, Dr. Briton.
Thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all. And if I disappoint you today, you can know that I'll be a long way from here tomorrow. Catch up with you. So I do want to come out again in the summer and see farming in the hot time of the year. Anyway, today I put together a presentation on kind of my past and my evolution of this particular test, but also the experience that I've had with respiration testing. One of the amazing things that I discovered early when I started looking at soil up close was that if you get down into the soil, it presents you with an atmosphere of elevated CO2, which is obviously due to biological respiration. Now, that elevated CO2 in situ that is down in the soil does include respiration both of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, as well as all the macrofauna and plant root respiration. So when we extract the soil from the field and bring it to the soil laboratory, dry it, grind it, sieve it, you've removed a little fraction of that respiration already when you're testing it, because you've removed it from the setting that it was in, and there's no more plant root respiration. And I don't know many macrofauna that survive soil drying, grinding, and sieving. I think we saw earlier from Abby's slides too that represents only a fraction of the total respiration, which is primarily bacterial and fungal. So the interesting thing is, if you go down into this particle, and I'd like to, using the example of Abby's film, do it, but this time with infrared goggles on, so you can see the CO2, you would find an atmosphere of at least 300 parts per million volumes of CO2. Just so we're all on the same page, the air in this room might be about 400 parts per million right now, although it's rising steadily with us all sitting here in the room. And if it got as high as 3,000 in this room, we would probably start falling asleep and drowsing off, and we wouldn't be able to pay attention. That's the normal atmosphere in a healthy soil. It just helps to realize we're going into a world that's completely different than the world that we are used to above ground. Now, having said that, soils are the largest reservoir of carbon in the world. If you ignore the deep oceans, which are essentially inactive carbon and doesn't come into cycle, it's extraordinary to see the amount of carbon. This fraction of the world's carbon includes atmosphere, soil, the warm oceans, the cold oceans, and land organisms. This is billions of tons, or gigatons. I tell my kids, don't tell me about gigabytes, but talk to me about gigatons, because this is where it's really interesting. 1,580 gigatons, and that's a low estimate. There's many studies out there trying to quantify the amount of carbon in the soil. But what we lose sight of, or we call it carbon, is that carbon is associated with organic nitrogen in a 10-to-1 ratio. So if you just do the math, 1,580 gigatons of carbon in the soil means there's 158 gigatons of organic nitrogen being held by that carbon thanks to humus. And this is what the whole issue is about, that that's there available for us to use and to support plant growth. And it has to do with the whole cycle. The excessive emphasis on carbon, there is no carbon in soil. It's organic matter. It's not present in elemental form. We're all talking carbon. And this is the common reductionism of our age. We take it right down to the elements, then we break it down, and then we break it down. But particularly in the soil health world, we're not talking carbon, we're talking carbon compounds, carbon-based compounds, carbon in bacteria, and so on. And most importantly, carbon associated with organic nitrogen. So back to the soil. The whole carbon balance in the soil is a really delicate thing. With most arable soils today in the world, they're probably less than 5% organic matter. That would be about 2.5% carbon. It does vary quite a bit naturally, but every year 1 to 5% of that is lost from CO2 respiration. And if that kept up unchecked and unreplenished, there would be no soil quality left. But all those 1,580 gigatons of carbon, guess where that would be? It would be in the atmosphere. In fact, we couldn't live in a world, we could not survive in a world in which all the carbon in the soil was suddenly transferred to the atmosphere. And that's why soil health plays such an important role in a clean atmosphere. But there are a lot of studies that have been done on the ability to sustain the carbon. I sat in on a paper by the Rothamsted team a few years ago at one of the Agronomy Society meetings, and they have these plot studies that have been running for 170 years with different management practices. If you ever have the occasion to read those reports, I recommend them. But they said you can sustain 1 ton a year additions of carbon continuously just from crop residues. So that obviously helps make up for some of these depletion losses. But tillage increases the losses because it warms the soil. It raises the temperature of the soil and the microbes respond to it. Irrigation increases the losses of carbon because it increases the respiration rate. And that has to be countered by increasing the level of residues and cover carbon in the system. There's 3 interrelated cycles of respiration, and this is early work I did. I'll give you a little glimpse of the history of that shortly. But whenever you talk of respiration in the system, it's an elegant, I hesitate to say complex system because as Lee told us, that's an excuse too of how we shouldn't understand it. But it's an elegant system where you have 1, 2, and 3 forms of respiration. Number 1, you have natural soil respiration that's consuming subsurface and surface oxygen and producing CO2. And that's this cycle here where oxygen penetrates the soil. Organisms consume oxygen within the soil and create a depletion there that causes a diffusion cycle here. The soil is porous enough, the air will enter it. The CO2 leaves the soil, builds up in the soil environment, so the roots there are suffused and bathed in an atmosphere of CO2. Climatologists talk about how the oceans are engaged in this dynamic balance of absorbing CO2 and releasing it, and it keeps our atmosphere in a steady state. But the soil is doing the same thing. So plant roots are there sitting in an atmosphere of bicarbonate and carbonate and CO2 factors in. That's why, that's one of the reasons, and I'll mention it later, that Rick Haney has changed the way we extract soils. Because the atmosphere of CO2 and carbonic acid is releasing nutrients constantly. And we have to think about that what is nature doing here, basically, is what I'm saying. Obviously, above ground, you have the opposite respiration. You have plants absorbing CO2 and releasing oxygen. If you look at it really close, it's actually been found that the CO2 comes out of the soil and goes right into the plants. It doesn't, the CO2 is heavier than air and it can sit there. And this old practice of having lots of hedgerows on a farm and walls around gardens helps keep the CO2 in. And I talked to one ecologist, he said, we might have a cycle actually out of the soil into the plant, back in the soil, out of the soil into the plant, and so on. It's really an amazing thing. Of course, with wind and all across the fields, the CO2 is out of there. And finally, you have this other CO2 cycle. The plant roots, unlike the photosynthetic organs, are taking up oxygen and giving out CO2. So they have their own respiratory cycle. Actually, at nighttime, when it's dark, that same kind of respiratory metabolism is happening above ground, and plants are releasing CO2. But the overwhelming balance is that they release more oxygen. So this is just warming up to diving into measuring CO2 in the soil. We talk a lot about soils as a carbon reservoir. This is just the soil profile. And you see all that darkening up there. as Abby already mentioned, this darkening has to do with the polymerization of organic matter. The formation of humus darkens it. I have made humus in petri dishes by feeding bacteria sugar, and they start excreting humic compounds, and it's darkening the dish. It's just an amazing thing to see the bacteria actually synthesizing humus right in a dish and releasing CO2 as they do it. So one of the things about the soil being a carbon sink, we shouldn't get too comfortable with that. I studied in Europe, as I'll discuss a little later, and in Europe they have a lot of scientists calling out to end the soil degradation because they say soils are no longer a carbon sink, but a carbon source. And it's because the net degradation is pushing more carbon out into the atmosphere than we're absorbing through good tillage practices and cover cropping and so on. And that, of course, shouldn't be taken as a general statement because it has to do with each farm situation. But look at the quantities. Just do the arithmetic. At 3% organic matter, the 6 inches of your soil has 30,000 pounds of carbon per acre. Now, if you multiply that, if you do that by the hectare, that's 36 tons a hectare. But actually, you should measure the whole top meter of soil. And if you apply the same arithmetic and assume a diminishing level of carbon going down, each hectare of soil is 100 to 200 tons of carbon. So you see where all the carbon is. And the fact that we're measuring a small amount of respiration and that respiration is controlling the health and fertility of our plants through the nitrification cycle is just an amazing phenomenon. I'm sure many of you are aware of this great project that NRCS has done with the organic carbon stocks in America. I just think it's fantastic that we're getting this kind of map. You can't really see this, but these are the tons per hectare of carbon in the top meter of soil. And you can see in these areas out here, we're in the medium range, and the very low areas are more in the dry areas. One of the surprising results of the study is that they found that the Southeast America is a significant reserve of carbon with these colors, and of course I come from, we might win the prize up here with lots of carbon, and that's because we have cooler soils and it's been accumulating faster than we're depleting it. So on my farm in Maine, I had 6 to 8% organic matter soils just routinely, and the respiration rate, however, is relatively low on these soils. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. So now let's get to Solvita. Actually, I want to jump ahead one slide and go to the history of it first. I've been at this quite a while. I went to a boarding school where the students ran a farm, and after that I decided I wanted to go into agriculture, but more on the science side. And agronomy school in the early 70s was, I hate to say it, was extremely boring to me. And I was rescued by Albert Schatz, who told me, I'm going to send you to Europe. He just started a university after leaving Washington University in St. Louis for these kinds of international studies. So in the mid-70s, I went to Germany and Sweden and worked in a comparative farming program where we were doing biology studies of conventional farms and organic farms. So we did this, and one of my advisors on this was the scientist at Hohenheim University who standardized CO2 respiration. He did his doctoral thesis on it in 1953, and in 1966, using CO2 respiration to determine nitrogen mineralization was a textbook method in Germany. And that's just to show you how long this has been in coming. So we used the method in field studies, and I incorporated it in soil testing in our laboratory in the 80s. We called it a soil quality test back then. And we did 7-day respiration and microaggregate stability tests. But the problem with 7-day respiration was it took a lot of work and time. It was a slow method. So in 1994, out of frustration, here, I used to be the guy assigned to do all the titrations. That's in the early 70s. Just titration after titration for CO2, you're using barium chemistry, it's toxic, you have to dispose of it carefully. We tried to automate titration in the 80s in our lab, and it still was, you could do 20 or 30 a day and that was it. You were exhausted, you had chemicals to dispose of. And that was when I resolved to change it, and I invented this gel technology where the gel itself absorbs CO2 and changes color. And we had to make it very quantitative. And it was in early 2000 that I met Rick Haney. I do want to give special credit to John Duran. He discovered us in the mid-90s that we were doing this Solvita work. He really encouraged me to keep working on it. And for those of you who know the early Soil Quality Institute documents, they had the Solvita listed as an alternate procedure. That's because it was just brand new back then. They were doing driver tube tests in the field to determine respiration. And now, with this integration into the soil health tool, we're getting much more serious about it and have increased our quality control. And today we have 30 labs in the USA using the CO2 burst test. In fact, I counted the number of soils that have been tested by this method in the last 3 years. 91,300 soils have been tested with this respiration method. And it really comes close to my goal of trying to get soil biology testing mainstream. And to do that, you have to make it attractive to the soil laboratories. A little bit about the early work. This is John Duran's early work in Nebraska. Mark, you probably recognize this. These are cylinders that they would push into the soil and suck the air out into a CO2 absorbent. And we reproduced that work with our test kit in order to calibrate it. That work has kind of sat by the wayside for 10 years. This field, in-situ CO2 respiration, and I'm going to come back out with it. We're doing a lot of work to retool it and make it more meaningful. A little bit about the chemistry that I developed. We wanted to create this detector that was colorimetric, so we did some fancy chemistry. It obeys a law called the Beer-Lambert law, where as CO2 is absorbed into it, it exponentially changes color. So the color numbers are just like arbitrary units, but if you graph it on log paper, you have a perfectly straight correlation. So we had to just invent a color chart to represent it. But you can see as you go higher in the color chart here, the rate of respiration is picking up dramatically. So the changes in this level are very low, so it's very sensitive to low fertility soils. And then as the fertility increases, there's enormous upswing in CO2 respiration. And that's very convenient because John Duran used to tell me, make sure you make it broad enough to be representative of most soils, but don't make it only sensitive for your favorite soils, these organic soils that have high respiration and excellent biology. So today we have two applications of it, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference. My work with Rick Haney at USDA ARS in Texas really focused in on creating a standardized laboratory procedure. Rick discovered us when we still had the basal respiration test. This is the original version of it, and the one that Abby showed this morning, and it's still a completely valid and useful test, but it's not considered by the scientists in the lab to be strictly quantitative because you're putting the soil in there to a volume and then measuring it, whereas here, we're weighing precisely 40 grams of soil into a cylinder that has a perforation in the bottom, and it lets water move up by capillary action, bringing it to field capacity in order to standardize it. So the laboratories are doing this procedure, and in the field you have this option available. I want to talk a little bit about this interesting phenomenon of drying humidity. What is CO2 burst? People say, well, what do you mean by that? CO2 burst is actually being studied very widely right now. And a paper out of, I believe it was Hohenheim University recently in Global Change Biology, goes after this whole thing of what are people meaning by CO2 burst and how does it compare to basal respiration? So common to most soils, drying and re-wetting triggers. When soil is dry and it rains, there's this huge burst of activity. And it's called a priming effect by some scientists. Others just call it a CO2 burst. But anybody that measures it, here's the drying here of the soil. The respiration goes down and down and down, and then the rain hits and boom, up it goes. Now this line here is called basal respiration. If the soil had no drying, it was moist evenly all the way through, this is what the respiration would look like. So when it dries, the microbes become fairly dormant, and then there's a burst of activity, and here's the priming effect right there. And they have studied at least 4 soil agroecosystems and determined there might be one where after re-wetting, there's no burst. But most of them, if this is a really long period of time and it re-moistens, you don't necessarily get a burst. But it's different in different soils. And the method we are using in the lab is essentially this. You bring it out of the field, dry it for a short period of time, moisten it, and bang, there's your CO2 burst right there. And the thing that's so unique about that is it enables us to measure very, very accurately a small amount of soil because we're getting that much more CO2 out of it at that time. Now, for people that think this looks like a destructive cycle, there's a lot of controversy. Does CO2 burst ruin your soils? That is, if nature keeps doing this, drying, re-wetting, and the verdict so far is that no, it does not, because the burst is only making up for what it lost here. So, and in that burst, what it's doing is it's releasing a flush of nitrogen at the same time. That's why measuring this is so interesting, because the microbes that adhere to this carbon-nitrogen ratio balance, unless you're throwing a whole bunch of carbon at them at that moment and they have to immobilize nitrogen to break it down, they're going to let go of a bunch of nitrogen right now. And that's why your lawns turn green so fast after rain. It's not just the water, it's the extra nitrogen that came with it. But this is a fascinating topic, and a lot of people are looking at it from the perspective of global carbon balances and the geochemistry of drought and drought phenomena. There's a lot of scientists that are looking at it completely from a different perspective, but it's helping my work, and it fructifies it by the fact that I can constantly find more and more papers discussing the phenomena, and it seems to be of generally increasing interest. So I mentioned earlier that, actually Lee made an important point, that just because you have something that looks good and has great merit doesn't mean people accept it. And so I invented it in '94 and I announced it to the world in silence, and it trickled in. John Durant was there saying, hey, that's great, that's a smart thing to do. But still, the change came very slowly. There were all the critics do say, no, you think you got the new silver bullet here, and so on and so forth. So we finally figured out that so much of what's happening in this country is being dictated by soil labs and soil testing, connected to crop consultants. And they have the farmer's ear. And what I tried to do with this is make this test attractive to soil labs. And Rick Heaney and I have been determined to do that. He told me the other day that he ran 7,000 samples for CO2 burst just in this first part of the year. And that's a good sign that we have finally broken the limits in terms of making something cost effective to be measured. So what my company did is we started reaching out to labs all over the country. And we have published a map on our website where you can zero in to your state and find, and I just put a list here of some of the labs nearby here that are using it. AgVise Labs, Ag Resource Consulting in Nebraska, we have 2 or 3. Ward Labs, definitely Midwest Labs, Cedar Basin Crop Consulting in Iowa, and but that's taken a lot of work. We had to get to them, meet with them, and they all look at you and say, "You're not going to make us adopt a new method, where will I fit this in?" And I have even suggested to them, you can throw out some of these tests you offer that are not very useful, and they just stare at you like, "Oh my God, what did you just say?" This is the business of farming in America, and I have a great deal of respect for it, but it's difficult convincing them. it's almost true also what Lee said, you have to let the older ones go away and the next generation come on. It's some of the sons of the managers of labs saying, hey, let's do this. But we're really proud of this, that this many labs have adopted it in the last 3 or 4 years. And you can zoom in on the map and see different colors, and that is the level of work that they're doing. Some of them are now moving up to the soil health tool, which is Rick Haney's development. It integrates Solvita into other types of carbon measurements. And I know that Ward Labs has moved in that direction, and we're hearing that Brookside Labs wants to do it. Midwest is interested. I'll be meeting with them and their crop consultants in February because we want to figure out how to sell this to the farmers, how to make it really meaningful to them. Well, it can't cost very much. Even though I can demonstrate I'm going to save them a lot of money on fertilizer, it still can't cost very much. And it has to really work for them. So I invited you to look at this, and here's the other message here is tell your crop consultant friends and your farmers to ask for the test, and the soil labs will listen to you. They don't listen to me, they say, you're just selling me something. But when it comes from the field, people say, okay. The soil labs say, well, if the farmers are interested, we're going to do this. So anyway, that's my pitch there. Rick and I have published several papers on all these correlations we've been doing. This is just showing you the CO2 bursts. Here's the soil just chugging along respiration in the field. You dry it and add water, and boom, you get all that CO2 coming out, and that's where you're getting these nutrient flushes. And that's what we're trying to standardize on. We've been very successful correlating one-day CO2 with 7-day end mineralization tests. You can see it looks almost like a yield response curve, suggesting that soil bacteria have some natural laws that they are adhering to. The higher the respiration, maybe the slower it's going. That's very interesting. These are crop studies we've done where we're looking at the CO2 burst relative to the yield, either in terms of the bushels or the amount of nitrogen uptake. And we're seeing these almost one-to-one equations of the CO2 burst in parts per million versus the pounds per acre of nitrogen, with some variance, and that will have to do with field conditions. The soil health tool modifies all this and throws in a curveball of determining the water-soluble CN ratio, because we don't want to overdo it. We don't want to tell a farmer, you've got nitrogen in the bank here for sure, if there's extra carbon in the system that's immobilizing the nitrogen. So he's added this water-soluble CN test, and I can talk more about that if there's time later. And that helps fine-tune this more, because the last thing I want to do is giving farmers a false sense of optimism. And I mean, look at all the nitrogen coming out of some of these normal soils here. Here's one at 40, just at 40 parts per million respiration, we're picking up 50 pounds an acre of nitrogen. And these are all control plots. These are unfertilized soils. And you do control plots to see what is the soil naturally supporting these plants with. So it's amazing to see that all this nitrogen is there for the crops to use based on this respiration in the soil. So let's look at some results here. I've been working with Ray Archuleta, who every now and then will send me a box of soils and say, check these out. And I've been down to Greensboro and visited some of these farms on these Piedmont soils. And this was a particularly interesting set of soils. The color's a little bit off. It seems a little bit overly yellow in this image. But we brought, he gave me 8 soils here. And one was a trick soil. There was this one here. But this was bare tilled tobacco, continuous tilled tobacco, 28 parts per million restoration. And this was Ray Steyer's no-till farm, and look at his topsoil here, 57 parts per million. These are the same soils, but it's darker because of the humus. His subsoil 3 inches down was still almost twice as good as continuous tilled neighbor soil at 41 parts per million. Then we went down the road and took a truck farm. This is just constant rototilled soil. These guys are, it was semi-organic too, so there's lots of fertilizers, lots of tillage, and look at the respiration, 12 parts per million. That's a depleted soil. You're not going to get any nitrogen out of that soil naturally. And then we had 3 no-till corns in different stages. It was a multi-species cover crop. 75 parts per million respiration, that is incredible. If they can sustain that, that soil is almost a nitrogen factory for the plants, if you can sustain it. But then they threw in an interesting one here at the end, and I finally called Ray and said, what was that last soil? It looked completely different. 78 parts per million, broke the limit, virgin prairie, never been tilled from Nebraska. Mike Kucera's farm. And I talked to him about it, and we got the soil maps on, and we know the exact point in the field where we took that sample. And that, you could almost say, this is what nature intended. A respiration at that level is going to supply enough nitrogen to keep the whole system going. And so it's really clear that we've broken out of this by depleting soils, getting down to levels like this. We just did a group of soils from Virginia, and I talked to the extension agent and somebody at Virginia Tech doing the study and said, you know, it's almost embarrassing how depleted these soils are. There's almost no respiration. We're seeing soils with respiration of 10 parts per million. It's like, wow, that is really depleted soil. So here's some of the fun things, and you've seen some examples of this already. Is going into a farm and getting to know the soil and then running the Solvita, and the farmers are doing this in the field, and then, you know, lining it up here with the soil chart. But we're seeing some amazing evidence of increased and enhanced soil respiration and soil biology using this approach and just going in the field. I often will take 0 to 3 inches and then 3 to 6 because you see tremendous differences in that small area. If you just average the top 6 inches, you sometimes get a worse picture than you'd like to see because there's so much light close to the surface there, particularly when you're no-tilling and cover cropping. Just a comment. I want to mention a little bit about basal respiration. This is a test I'm trying to redevelop. The quantitative scientists start shivering when they see these kind of pores coming out and here, but it's working really well. And there's a little bit of magic in Solvita. I deliberately designed it not to be a sink for carbon. I didn't want it to grab all the CO2. We designed it to be a buffer for the headspace, meaning it reacts to the concentration of CO2 in the system. So it's listening to the soil. It's not pulling the CO2 out of it. And what this means, if you keep the same volume to soil ratio, you can test the system out at any size. It will give you the same readings. So we're able to take, these are like half kilogram size cores that we're taking out of soil. And I'm going to publish a recommendation because you have to increase the size of the jar. So the ratio is about 4 to 1 if you do the whole particle density, air pore space versus head space, and then dry weight of the soil. If you keep it relatively constant, Solvita will work at any size soil sample. Because I want to move us now towards trying to get the soil out of the field as undisturbed as possible into a system where we can measure it, because that's the real respiration. What we're doing in the laboratory, you could say, is somewhat artificial. We're drying the soil and then we're letting the CO2 burst express itself. But this, we're trying to get closer to the soil. And thank God there's so much interest in carbon these days. There's so many papers now being published just on what is basal respiration, how much is there per square meter of land, so I can go out there. And we've got this procedure completely calibrated now. We're getting the same numbers that people are with these flux chambers and other more sophisticated devices, and I'm feeling very comfortable about it. In the NRCS material on measuring soil respiration, this is on their website. That has been recently updated. We're working with folks down in Nebraska on this. I think we'll probably do one more update when I really get this basal thing worked out with the instructions for the field. But some of you have seen these charts, and so on both of them. This is what's, this comes from our Solvita manual, but this has been pretty closely harmonized with what's on the NRCS website. And it was designed to give some meaning to this. Like, here's the increasing life of your soil, this curve here, and these are these color gradations off of the chart. I even have it slightly declining here, meaning like got your soils that active, it could almost be too active. And I'll describe some that I'm working on in New Zealand right now where we cannot believe the respiration of some of their sheep pasture system soils. But the respiration of their soils is about 3 times higher than anything I've seen here. And so we're looking at what does that mean for the nitrogen cycle. But we're trying to work with some ecologists on showing also emissions as kilograms per square meter. And this is like pounds per acre per day. Just look at some of these numbers. On a depleted soil, you might be releasing 2 to 5 pounds of CO2 carbon per day per acre. That's a small amount. It would fill a small bucket. A healthy soil, 30 to 140 pounds of carbon per day per acre coming out into the air. I mean, I like to say, I wish people could see this because you would be amazed by the amount of carbon that you're walking through that is being emitted from the soil. And that's a natural, healthy cycle because it's not that you're depleting soils and dumping carbon into the atmosphere, you're increasing the sink of carbon in the soil and it's reflected by this higher respiration rate. It's really important to see it in that positive light. A little bit more on the work we're doing now. This is that modified cylinder that John Durant first published on. And you can take a Solvita paddle and put it right inside that and drive it into the ground, seal it with saran and cover it with something very bright and reflective, which is aluminum foil, and then get a in-situ basal respiration reading. And these are much different numbers than you get from the CO2 burst, but it's very indicative of your soil at the time. It depends on the moisture. I always use a thermometer with it because who knows what the temperature of the soil is at the time of the test. And in the laboratory, we have to control all that so people are seeing the same results no matter which lab they go to. I wanted to just mention this thing of the factors that influence the rate and efficiency of soil CO2. These are soil monitoring stations that from the Soil Climate Analysis Network, and I grabbed one from where I grew up in central Pennsylvania to compare to a region that I like to visit, which is the Palouse. And the red is the rising temperature beginning at the new year and ending in winter again. You can just see both systems share a similar rise and fall of temperature. What's markedly different is the moisture behavior, which is the blue line. In Pennsylvania, we go through the winter into spring really, really wet, and then it starts drying down as the heat builds up. And then you have these are the CO2 bursts, these rain events that trigger, and then the moisture rises again at the end of the year. The combination of the temperature and the moisture is controlling your respiration. But look at in the Palouse, a few rainfall events, there's these huge spikes of moisture. Those are severe drying, re-wetting events. There's probably a big pulse of nutrients right then. It happens to be as the crops are growing. So nature's got an ideal system there, trying to make up for the low moisture overall by these rainfall events. But you have to have a sense of the local situation before you make too many generalizations about it. So here's what's really happening. This blue here is the loss of carbon. The soil organic matter evolved as CO2. And I mapped it to that Pennsylvania chart using temperature and moisture. So the soil respiration through the course of the year looks almost like your crop production cycle. Again, this is Pennsylvania. It would be very different in other parts of the country. So your depletion of CO2, but also your respiration will be highest in July and August, and then fall precipitously. And what keeps soils healthy and keeps them from losing all their carbon is these cold parts of the year too. And shading soil lowers the temperature, lowers the respiration, and so on. Okay, how are we doing on time? I want to just go back in time. I was stationed at a research experiment station in Sweden in the 70s, and I was lucky to be there when they were completing a 17-year crop rotation study, which is these field plots here. And of course, I was an immediately sent to the cellar to do all the CO2 titration, enzyme assays. We went out in the field and dug pits and counted earthworm canals, and we did all this work way back then. So, and when it was published with Humus University, they said it was the most popular scientific bulletin that had ever been produced at that university. They had to reprint it 5 times in 1 year. And it just shows you, in Europe, they were a little bit early and ahead of us, but studies that had to do with soil biology were really catching the attention of growers. And of course, the organic farmers use this and publicize this information very widely to get some attention on their concerns about soil degradation. But these plots were laid out, and here's the work I did, and we do have an English version of this that I prepared, showing these are all different plots, manage the same crop rotation but different fertilizer strategies for 17 years. And this is the respiration rate in CO2, and this is the earthworm counts. Look at the differences in earthworms. These 3 treatments here is the only fertilizer was inorganic NPK. There was no manure management. Mainly the study was looking at manure management and composting manure management with a 4-year crop rotation. But the highest fertility, the highest earthworm counts was the manure-based farming system, and it had nearly the highest respiration. This was like the highest quality compost they could find from on the market was here. Didn't quite do as good as raw manure, but gave very high respiration. Well, just last month, I got my data out again, and I replotted it. I said, okay, this tells us something really important. So these are 17 years of effects where I've taken the group averages and plotted them against soil CO2 respiration and earthworm canals. And look at that amazingly tight respiration. This curve here is using our 7-day respiration data, and this is using the 1-day. Nobody believed in 1-day respiration in the 70s and 80s. They all told me, oh, that's too short. You can't measure the system that quickly. Well, Rick Haney and Franz Lubers have disproved that very clearly in their published papers, but thank God we actually did 1 day back then, because look at the numbers. They're the same numbers that Solvita gives you now, between 0 and 150. In other words, we're all measuring the same universe here, and going from 50 to 150 was, in terms of the change in earthworm population, highly significant effects here, was an increase of like 10 canals per square meter to here of 120. In other words, respiration now could be seen as an indicator, just as a sign of the overall biology of the system. I mean, you could reverse the correlation and say, let's correlate CO2 with earthworms, and you're going to get the same relationship. We did all the enzymes in soils and found multiple correlations with enzyme activity. Dehydrogenase was very significant. Urease enzyme was always very high where manure was in the system, so you could use that as an indicator. And but respiration overall, I came away from this, and it's obviously why I've done so much work with respiration, is it was the simplest, healthiest indicator of the whole system. Whether you did short-term respiration or the 7-day, I don't think anybody does 7-day anymore unless you're a researcher. It just takes so much time to do it. I want to kind of finish here with a new test that we're coming out with that I'm very, very excited about. We actually have a test that we sell to people with manure and compost to measure volatile ammonia. And again, I have to thank Rick Haney for this. He called me one day about a year ago and he said, Will, stick those ammonia paddles in soil. And I said, that won't work. No, he said, try it. Stick them in soil, see what happens. And we did it, and we got low-level ammonia detection. And I said, oh, well, if we add a little alkali to the soil, what will happen then? And this is what happened. These are our ammonia detection paddles without any change in the chemistry. But we've taken those same neat soils I just showed you. This is that continuous tobacco crop soil. This is that rototilled truck garden soil, and this is the virgin prairie. And we added a little bit of alkali to soil. What it does is it sets free amino nitrogen that's bound, weakly bound in the humus. It's the most readily available organic nitrogen. And the color changes from yellow to deep green depending on the amount of nitrogen. And look at how these soils jumped out at us. The raised Dyer's topsoil in the no-till system almost took the price. 278 parts per million of nitrogen came out of that soil in 24 hours. And then that's hiding there right in the background. Look at this soil, totally depleted. We're using these kinds of things to calibrate and get the interpretation. 73 parts per million in this depleted. I mean, that's almost nothing. I'm learning from this what would be considered beneath detection, very low. And here's that good old prairie soil right up there, over 200 parts per million of amino N just sitting there in the humus. Now, I can't tell you and guarantee you your plants will get this or all of it. But it's pretty readily available and it's hiding right there. None of us have been measuring it in our laboratories. It does not show up when you do an ammonium extraction. It doesn't show up when you do nitrate extraction, but it's hiding right there. And we're seeing when you bring in the cover crops into the system, it starts lighting the system up. So I think what it is, it's indicating recent biology. And that's what we want to look for, indicators of recent biology. I'm going to jump ahead of this and show. Mark Hutchinson from University of Maine and I just gave a paper on this 2 weeks ago at the ASA meetings in Tampa, Florida. And this was a kind of a serendipitous discovery. We were doing a field plot study with different applications rates of different types of compost to sweet corn. And we were trying to determine the yield efficiency and the nitrogen turnover in relation to the type of soil testing we were doing. And we had two plots called plot 1 and plot 2 that just kept breaking all the records for yield. And this is the second year of the study. So I ran this SLAN test on it. This is the SLAN amino nitrogen for all 21 plots across the field, with subtracting out the background of the untreated soils. And look at plots 1 and 2, it just shot right up there. What was going on with plots 1 and 2? On the CO2 bursts, they were at the top. And in the 1 week nitrogen mineralization, they were also at the top. And they exceeded the yield of all the rest of the field by a long shot. In fact, we determined at the end of the year, they wouldn't have needed any fertilizer at all. So we had to go to the farm manager at the experiment station and say, what happened down there in plots 1 and 2? And he said, oh, I forgot to tell you, I plowed on the sod there because you needed a bigger field. So just in that area, the sod plowed down, it kicked out all that nitrogen. We know this happens. But our test had indicated that there was going to be between 50 and 75 parts per million. That's 100 to 150 pounds an acre of extra nitrogen set in play there. Again, we don't know how much the plants got, but from the yields we determined they pretty much got it all, and we wasted our money on fertilizer where we used it, and all the other plots were distant in terms of the quantities here. The correlations were very good, but again, we didn't set out to discover this. But in hindsight now, we should have run that before we did the plot studies and said, you know what, we should probably randomize this field or something because we've got some interesting things going on here. And it's just, this kind of research just helps form the basis for calibrating it and understanding the meaningful content of it. So as a summary, what are we learning, what do we know right now about these different methods? This CO2 burst one, if you're working with labs doing it, you know, I'm trying to be very simple and group it into 3 levels. Very low biology, 0 to 20 parts per million, moderate biology, 20 to 60, and high biology, 60 to 150. If you do the same soil in basal respiration mode, that is out in the field, do not disturb it, don't bring it into the lab. This is the same soil, the respiration rate. So look how much lower it is. It's about almost a 7-to-1 difference. In other words, in nature, soils are respiring at a much lower level, than they actually are in the laboratory, but they correlate with each other. And this kind of respiration should be used for climate modeling and probably ultimately for nitrogen modeling in order to work out just how much nutrient it's going to set free. If you do the SLAN test, so far, the preliminary interpretation is that if you're under 100 parts per million, you've got a soil extremely depleted in biology. Probably has had no cover crop, been continuously tilled, and so on. And if you're getting these numbers, 200 to 400 range, something really amazing is going on in that soil. They've been doing something very good. I can't see the negative of it. The soils I mentioned from New Zealand that we're looking at now, they're right off the chart here at 250 parts per million respiration routinely. We don't have any basal on them because they haven't done it yet. And they're right up at 400 parts per million on the amino nitrogen in the soil. And they don't have to fertilize these soils, certainly not for nitrogen. And they come to us saying, how do we characterize them? And actually, it's a funny story. The guy called me, he was running Solvita, and he called me from New Zealand and said, I hate to tell you, the test's not working. We get this all the time. And I said, well, what do you mean it's not working? He said, well, it turned yellow right away, so I guess it failed. You know, there's something wrong with the test. I said, it turned yellow right away? Like, how quickly? He said, in 4 to 5 hours. So we brought it in the lab, and when we have a test like that, we run it in, we have a 10-channel infrared respirometer that looks at it every 5 minutes, and we found that indeed in 6 hours it had already maxed out the Solvita at 150 parts per million. So these are high biology soils. We just have to study them a little bit differently. I did learn recently that there's a group at UC Davis trying to take my test and turn it into a 6-hour test. We'll see. I know it'll work in New Zealand. I don't think it'll work in this country on our relatively low organic matter soils. But trying to make it really fast, of course, is his goal of many scientists, although the soil laboratories tell me they're really pleased that it's a 24-hour test. You take it in one day, you run it, all the other tests are being run, the next day the reports are being generated, on the third day they're out. So we've created a system that at least works well with the existing infrastructure. But for those of you that are playing around with this, keep these numbers in mind, and if you think it doesn't fit into that scheme, let me know. We are getting labs that are getting confused between basal and CO2. If you run the sample with, if you didn't dry it before the test, it's going to behave more like a basal test than a CO2 burst, and your numbers will be low. And they're coming to me and saying, oh, it's not working, the numbers are low. And I say, there must have been some moisture in that sample before you ran it. And we actually triggered an investigation of ALP and NAPT soils and found there's background water in them. So I had to go back to all the soil labs and said, they didn't tell you there's background water in the samples. They look dry, but you have to dry them to trigger the CO2 burst. It only works if the soil gets below like 4% moisture. Somehow that triggers the CO2 burst. Otherwise, the soil kind of goes into its slow basal filtering mode with lower respiration. So, soil health tool. My laboratory has been coordinating with Rick Haney the release of the soil health tool, and we're going to come out with a new version of it in January where it's not on a spreadsheet as you're familiar with, but it's kind of a single page per sample, but it'll have all the same information in it that Rick Haney's test run will have. And I know you can't see this here, I'd like to zoom in, but you get a soil health tool rating, you get the organic water-soluble CN ratio, you get the Solvita CO2 burst, and you get microbially active carbon, which is a routine part of it, and then you get nitrate and ammonia. Water extract for organic carbon, water extract for organic nitrogen. We use the ratio of that to get the CN ratio. We use that to modify the recommended amount of nitrogen that the soil needs. Right now we're giving a minimum and maximum nitrogen release potential on the soils. I keep coordinating my equations with Rick's because we want all the labs to essentially agree on the equations but have some flexibility there. Rick used to show peak saturation and iron and aluminum, and he integrates it into the results but doesn't, and we're probably going to show it because like if you have a soil with a very low P saturation with his new extract, that's definitely a soil that's going to need some phosphorus. So it's an exciting new way of testing soils. This one I only put it up here, but it had a soil health tool rating of 0.8. That was from Arkansas. Very, very high in nitrate and ammonium. So they're hitting it with lots of nitrogen. At the end of the season, they had over 100 pounds of available nitrogen still in soil. There was almost no microbially active carbon, very, very low respiration. Look at that, 3.8 parts per million on the CO2 burst. It almost couldn't be lower. That soil needs a lot of work. And one soil here from Montana that came in completely opposite. It's still high in available nutrients, but much higher soil health score rating. You have to talk to the growers and find out what they're doing, to find out how did they get that good score. But for those of you that are thinking of going in this direction, it's going to be a fun voyage to make it. There are several labs interested in going to the next level, but there are several labs here today that are doing soil CO2 bursts, and maybe they would be willing to share some of their experiences. I think I'm going to leave off here now and take time for any questions.
We absolutely have time. Questions, comments from the audience?
I'm John Lee with AgVise Laboratories, and we've been running the Solvita test primarily for researchers and people within NRCS the last few years. We're hoping it'll give some value or some other information to use in addition to the soil nitrate test, which we can use successfully in our drier parts of the U.S. So, we're waiting for other research. We're doing testing for some of the researchers at the University of Minnesota. They're doing some of their own. At ND-SWCS, they're doing some of their own, and hoping that this tool will somehow fit the big scheme of things down the road. The one question I have was the SLAN test, the amino sugar test. If you had run that before the sod was broken up, would you have gotten the same kind of numbers?
I'm not sure. That's a very interesting question. We ran those samples that I showed you in July, so the sod had already been broken up, and we need to find out if it had to have been broken up to dump the nitrogen into that amino pool or not. But there's a lot of people interested in it now, and I think we're going to find that answer probably within the next year or two.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question. This relates to some research that was done at the Oaks Irrigation Field Trials. And I'll just throw this out. I think I've talked with John about this before, but it was just adding, I believe it was 100 pounds of 1152 fertilizer on soybean ground. It was irrigated. And one year, I wish I had the exact numbers, but they grew 150 bushels of corn. Well, I'll just throw this out without the exact number. It was 150 bushels of corn with no other than that 11 pounds of nitrogen. The next year, in the same replicated research, I think they got like 60 or 70 bushels of corn. And I'm just wondering, like I said, I'm just thinking out loud here, is any of these testing that you're doing would help us to either anticipate or predict, and I'm sure it relates to soil moisture and temperatures and sunshine and all of those kind of things, but it's very tough for us to predict nitrogen output from the soil in this area, and I just wonder if you have any comments on it.
Where are you?
We're in southeastern North Dakota.
Okay. Did you do any soil residual nitrate tests in that area? Was there a lot of residual nitrate in that first year that could have partly explained that big yield kick? And it got used up by the plants, and then the next year it wasn't there, and they were relying more on the soil biology.
Since it was soybeans was the previous crop, and I think this was, in a system, And I know he would have the numbers on that, but I think you would have in general 20 to 30 pound soil nitrate indicated, that's usually left with soybeans.
What had they grown before soybeans?
I believe it was corn. But typically what I've seen, and John probably attested this too, that soybeans will generally mop up any nitrogen that's left, whether it was good crop corn or bad crop corn.
Well, I will say, we don't see swings in soil biology of that extent that would explain the difference. So you're going to have to look back and say, did you miss something? Was this nitrate from previous years? How deep did you monitor the profile? I see some people doing 2-foot deep nitrate testing now routinely and finding that it